June 6, 1944. The Cotentin Peninsula. German sentries of the 91st Luftlandedivision Division looked up from their posts along the Normandy hedgerows when they first heard it, a faint drone far out over the channel. At first it sounded like distant thunder, but within minutes the sky itself began to vibrate. Hundreds of engines blended into a single roar that shook window panes and rattled dishes in farmhouses across the French countryside. What the German soldiers didn't yet know was that more than 800 Douglas C-47 transport aircraft were thundering overhead in formation, stretching for miles. Packed inside were 15,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. They carried rifles, bazookas, demolition charges, and the orders that would decide the fate of the Allied invasion: seize the causeways, block German reinforcements, and sow chaos behind the Atlantic Wall. At 0016, green lights blinked on inside the lead aircraft. Jumpmasters shouted the order. Every man had drilled 100 times. Stand up! Hook up! Doors opened and icy night air blasted the fuselage. One by one, men hurled themselves into the darkness. For the German sentries below, the first sight was ghostly, parachutes blossoming against the moonlit sky, hundreds, then thousands, drifting down through the fog. Tracer fire arced upward as German machine guns tried to claw at the silhouettes, but the scale overwhelmed comprehension. An after-action report from the 91st Division described it in clipped terms. Enemy landed in great number at several points simultaneously. Strength appears far greater than initial estimates, impossible to contain. Within minutes, paratroopers were landing across dozens of miles, in fields, orchards, marshes, even rivers. Many were scattered, some drowned in flooded lowlands, others landed directly on top of German outposts and fought hand-to-hand before they could even unclip their harnesses. Yet the sheer volume created paralysis in German command. Radio lines filled with panicked calls. Officers demanded clarity. Was this a raid, a diversion, or something larger? Reports contradicted one another. To the Germans, it seemed as if the Allies had materialized everywhere at once. By dawn, 15,000 Americans were on French soil, not on the beaches, but behind German lines. The Wehrmacht had trained for an Allied landing. What they had not prepared for was an airborne invasion of unprecedented scale, dropping from the night sky itself. For the German High Command, airborne forces were not a mystery. They had pioneered the concept themselves. In May 1941, thousands of Fallschirmjäger had descended on the island of Crete in the largest airborne assault ever attempted. The operation succeeded, but the cost was staggering: over 6,000 German casualties in a single campaign. Adolf Hitler drew his own conclusion: large-scale airborne drops were too risky. After Crete, the Wehrmacht relegated its paratroopers to elite infantry roles, never again attempting a mass parachute assault. This doctrinal shift created a blind spot. By 1944, German commanders assumed that Allied airborne forces would mirror their own, small raiding parties. A few battalions at most dropped to seize a bridge or sabotage supply lines. It was inconceivable that the Allies would risk entire divisions in the darkness, where wind, flak, and navigation errors could scatter men across the countryside. German intelligence reports before D-Day estimated Allied airborne strength in Britain at no more than 6,000 men total. In reality, the Americans alone had trained and equipped more than double that number. The U.S. Army Airborne Command under General Matthew Ridgway had embraced the opposite conclusion from Hitler. Where the Germans saw unacceptable risk, the Americans saw opportunity. Speed, shock, and sheer volume would be their armor. If enough men dropped at once, even scattered and disorganized, their presence would paralyze German response. One German colonel later admitted, "We believed paratroopers were commandos, a handful at a time." What arrived in Normandy was an entire army from the sky. To make it possible, the United States had invested enormous resources. 2 full divisions, the 82nd and 101st, were trained specifically for mass airborne assault. They drilled relentlessly in night jumps, equipment drops, and coordination with glider infantry. The Americans developed specialized gear, reserve chutes, quick-release harnesses, leg bags packed with rifles and explosives. Every detail reflected a doctrine built on scale rather than selectivity. When 15,000 paratroopers fell into the fields and villages of Normandy, it was not a raid. It was a strategy the Germans had dismissed as fantasy. Their assumptions collapsed in real time as reports poured into headquarters from every corner of the Cotentin Peninsula. By the time dawn broke, German commanders realized they were not facing scattered raiders. They were facing two complete American divisions behind their own lines, something they had never imagined possible. The decision to commit 15,000 paratroopers to the night skies over Normandy was not inevitable. Inside Allied headquarters, opinions were divided. Airborne operations were still new, and even senior commanders questioned whether mass drops could succeed. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had argued against relying heavily on paratroopers, pointing to German failures at Crete. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, responsible for air operations, predicted catastrophic losses. He warned that up to 70% of American paratroopers could be killed or captured before reaching their objectives. Yet General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, believed the risk was worth it. The entire invasion hinged on securing the narrow causeways that connected Utah Beach to the interior of the Cotentin Peninsula. If German reinforcements reached the beaches in strength before the landings were secure, the invasion could fail in its opening hours. Conventional infantry arriving by sea would not be fast enough to block the roads. Only airborne troops dropped directly onto those routes could do it. Eisenhower accepted the gamble, telling his staff, "If we succeed, we win the war. If we fail, the whole operation collapses." The scale of the commitment reflected American industrial and organizational capacity. The U.S. Air Force allocated more than 800 C-47 transport aircraft, each capable of carrying 28 paratroopers. Gliders would bring in heavier equipment, jeeps, artillery, even anti-tank guns at dawn. In total, nearly 5,000 tons of men, weapons, and supplies would be hurled into occupied France in a single night. German officers who later studied the operation were stunned by the audacity. To them, the deployment of so many men into hostile territory at night, without armor or heavy artillery, seemed suicidal. Yet it was precisely this gamble that magnified the effect. German commanders receiving fragmented reports of parachutes, firefights, and villages under attack assumed no rational opponent would risk so many troops unless the invasion was already underway. The psychological impact was as decisive as the tactical one. At midnight on June 6, 1944, the Americans proved willing to wager entire divisions on the principle that shock and dispersion could paralyze the enemy. For the Wehrmacht, it was unthinkable. For the Allies, it was the key to unlocking Normandy. The men who stepped out of C-47s over Normandy were not ordinary infantry. They were the product of one of the most demanding training pipelines in the U.S. Army. At Fort Benning, Georgia, volunteers for the airborne endured weeks of relentless drills. Every man had to master 5 qualifying jumps before earning the silver wings of a paratrooper. Failure was not tolerated. Roughly 1 in 3 washed out, unable to cope with the heights, the speed of exits, or the brutal landings. Training went far beyond the parachute itself. Recruits learned to assemble weapons in darkness, to navigate by compass across miles of countryside, and to fight in small scattered units with little guidance. The doctrine assumed that once on the ground, confusion would be inevitable. Men would land far from their assigned zones, equipment would be lost, leaders would be killed. The solution was to build soldiers who could improvise. "Every man a leader" became less a motto than a necessity. Compared to their German counterparts, the contrast was stark. By 1944, the once elite Fallschirmjäger had been converted into light infantry, often fighting without parachutes at all. Their training emphasized precision landings in daylight, tightly coordinated assaults that relied on intact units. American airborne training turned that model upside down. The expectation was chaos, and the solution was to train soldiers who could thrive in it. The preparation was also physical. At Camp Tacoka in Georgia, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment drilled on Currahee Mountain, running 3 miles up and 3 miles down, day after day, until endurance became second nature. Weapons were jumped within heavy leg bags. Paratroopers practiced assembling mortars, setting charges, and firing bazookas immediately after landing, sometimes with instructors throwing live ammunition overhead to simulate combat stress. The equipment itself was adapted for the mission. Troopers carried lightweight folding carbines, demolition satchels, and reserve chutes. Radios were few, so every soldier was trained to navigate by map and compass. Instructors hammered into them that once their boots hit the ground, they were cut off. No tanks, no artillery, only what they carried and what they could capture. By the time the 82nd and 101st Airborne boarded their transports in June 1944, they were not just soldiers, but specialists in organized disorder. They had trained for years to turn confusion into opportunity. It was exactly that preparation that allowed scattered groups of paratroopers to paralyze entire German divisions before dawn on D-Day. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, the German soldiers manning flak batteries along the Norman coast looked up into the night sky and saw something no one in the Wehrmacht had ever witnessed before. At first it was a few navigation lights glinting through the mist. Then the horizon itself began to glow, and the thunder of engines rolled overhead without end. More than 800 C-47 Dakota transport aircraft, supported by hundreds of additional planes towing gliders, stretched across nearly 200 miles of sky. From horizon to horizon, it was an airborne armada larger than any formation ever assembled in history. The numbers were staggering. The U.S. 9th Troop Carrier Command deployed 821 C-47s for the initial drop alone. Each carried about 28 paratroopers, their jump harnesses hooked to static lines that would rip their chutes open as they exited. Behind them came gliders packed with jeeps, artillery pieces, and anti-tank guns. In total, more than 1,200 aircraft filled the air. German observers later admitted the sight was overwhelming. One report from the 709th Infantry Division described it simply. The sky was full of enemy aircraft, impossible to count. They came in endless waves. Technology gave the Americans further advantages. Special Pathfinder teams jumped first, dropping radio beacons called Eureka sets that guided the incoming transports. Pilots carried Rebecca receivers to home in on those signals. Colored panels and lights marked designated drop zones, creating a network of invisible cues across the darkened French countryside. German officers who examined captured equipment later were astonished at the sophistication. Their own airborne operations in 1941 had relied mainly on daylight and visual markers. Even the sound carried psychological impact. French civilians recalled windows rattling as formation after formation droned overhead for more than 2 hours. German troops wrote of aircraft engines without end, a reminder that American industry could fill the skies as easily as the seas. When the green lights switched on in the cabins, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the slipstream. Within minutes, thousands of parachutes billowed against the night sky. German machine gunners opened fire, tracers climbing toward the massive aircraft, but the scale made resistance feel hopeless. Every few seconds, another stick of paratroopers jumped, until whole fields seemed covered with white canopies drifting to earth. For the German defenders, the air itself had become an invasion route. Never before had they seen the sky turn into a highway carrying 2 entire divisions into their rear areas. For all its scale and planning, the great airborne armada did not deliver precision. As soon as the first waves of C-47s crossed the French coast, they flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. German 20 mm and 88 mm guns filled the sky with bursting tracers. Pilots broke formation, climbing, diving, and swerving to avoid flak. In the darkness, with low cloud and heavy ground fire, navigation became nearly impossible. The carefully drawn drop zones on Allied maps quickly dissolved into confusion. Paratroopers were scattered across a patchwork of fields, villages, and flooded marshes. Some landed miles from their intended objectives. Others dropped directly into rivers or canals, dragged down by heavy equipment until they drowned. Entire sticks of men disappeared into the night with no trace. One battalion of the 101st Airborne was spread across more than 20 miles of countryside, its units unable to locate each other until days later. Yet while this chaos was costly, it also became a weapon. Small groups of Americans improvised into ad hoc platoons, attacking whatever targets they could find: roadblocks, bridges, telephone lines, or isolated German outposts. With no clear picture of Allied strength, German commanders received conflicting reports. One message claimed hundreds of parachutes near Carentan, another insisted thousands had landed outside St. Mary-Glees, while a third reported heavy firefights along the Murderate River. The scattered drops convinced many Germans that far more paratroopers had landed than the 15,000 actually deployed. German diaries recorded the bewilderment. A captain of the 91st Luftlande Division wrote, "Every hedgerow seemed to hide enemy troops. We did not know their numbers, only that they were everywhere. Even isolated American squads created the impression of entire regiments by ambushing convoys, cutting phone lines, and vanishing into the dark. Inside the airborne units, leadership by sergeants and junior officers proved decisive. Men who had trained for months to operate independently now acted without waiting for orders. A handful of paratroopers holding a crossroads could delay German armor for hours. A squad with a single bazooka could block an entire column until dawn. What appeared to Allied commanders as near disaster in the air turned into advantage on the ground. By scattering across dozens of miles, the paratroopers created the illusion of overwhelming strength. For the Wehrmacht, the drop was not simply chaotic, it was disorienting, a nightmare without a clear front or rear. In the early hours of June 6th, the first German commanders tried to make sense of what was happening in the Cotentin Peninsula. At the headquarters of the 91st Luftlande Division, telephone lines crackled with contradictory reports. Local garrisons insisted they were under attack by enemy commandos. Others claimed hundreds of parachutes had descended near St. Mary-Glise. One panicked observer swore that paratroopers had dropped directly onto his unit's command post. At first, German officers assumed it was a diversion. The logic was simple. The real invasion would come by sea, so any paratroopers in the interior must be small raiding parties. Colonel Eugen von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, was ordered to move against what higher command believed was a limited landing. As dawn approached, his men realized the situation was far larger. Everywhere they marched, they encountered scattered groups of American paratroopers, never massed in one place, but always present, ambushing convoys, blowing bridges, and cutting communications. The shock was immediate. German doctrine emphasized discipline, strict chains of command, and coordinated counterattacks. What they found instead were American squads that seemed to operate without orders, appearing in unexpected places, striking, then vanishing. A sergeant in the 1058th Grenadier Regiment later wrote, "We fired on one small group, then another opened fire from behind us. We thought there must be thousands." One of the first firefights erupted near St. Mary-Glise, where men of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment seized the crossroads leading to Utah Beach. German defenders fought back fiercely but were surprised by the determination of small airborne squads. Even isolated paratroopers with rifles and grenades fought as if they commanded entire companies. To the Germans, it appeared coordinated, though in reality, many Americans were simply improvising. The confusion worked in the paratroopers' favor. German headquarters at St. Lo received so many conflicting reports that it became impossible to calculate Allied strength. Some commanders estimated 40,000 troops had landed, nearly triple the actual number. Fear magnified the impact of every firefight. By the time sunrise lit the Norman fields, German commanders understood they were not dealing with a diversion. These were not scattered raiders. They were the vanguard of an army dropped from the sky. For the Wehrmacht officers who had discounted airborne warfare since Crete, the realization was stunning. The Americans had done what Hitler himself had declared impossible. The true purpose of the American airborne drops revealed itself at dawn. Behind Utah Beach stretched miles of flooded marshland. The Germans had deliberately inundated the low fields by opening sluice gates along the Douve River, turning the terrain into a natural moat. Only 4 narrow causeways rose above the water, each one a potential choke point where German reinforcements could rush to the beach. If those roads remained open, American infantry waiting ashore would face tanks and artillery within hours. That morning, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne moved to seize them. At the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, small groups of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment established defensive positions along Causeway No. 2, the most direct route inland. At the Lafayette Bridge over the Meurthe River, men of the 82nd clashed with German troops in a bitter, day-long fight to hold the crossing. Other units blocked side roads with mines, felled trees, and hasty barricades, improvising obstacles from whatever material they could find. The Germans were stunned at the resistance. Panzer units moving toward the coast reported taking fire from enemy forces entrenched on every approach. One battalion commander described advancing along a causeway only to find bazooka teams hidden behind hedgerows, striking from point-blank range before vanishing. The 91st Luftlande Division's reports noted repeated ambushes, broken communications, and enemy paratroopers holding bridges with great determination. For the paratroopers, the mission was costly. At La Fière, waves of German counterattacks supported by artillery pushed the Americans to the brink. The casualties mounted, ammunition ran low, and paratroopers often fought hand-to-hand to keep the bridge intact. Yet they held. Reinforced by glider troops later in the day, they maintained control of the crossing, ensuring that German armor could not reach Utah Beach in strength. By nightfall, 3 of the 4 main causeways remained in American hands. The Germans had expected to sweep across them within hours of the seaborne invasion. Instead, every road became a contested battlefield. German commanders realized too late that a few thousand scattered paratroopers had accomplished what divisions of conventional infantry could not. They had severed the lifelines between the beaches and the German reserves. When the first waves of American infantry moved inland from Utah Beach, they found the causeways still open, not because engineers had built them, but because paratroopers had bled to hold them. By mid-morning on June 6, German commanders had begun to organize counterattacks. The 91st Luftlandedivision Division, reinforced by elements of the 709th Infantry and scattered armored detachments, received orders to push south and drive the American paratroopers off the causeways. From Carentan to St. Mary-Glise, columns of infantry and half-tracks moved cautiously through the hedgerows, expecting to brush aside what they still believed were small raiding forces. The reality was far different. Every road seemed blocked. At the hamlet of Poupeville, troopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment fought from stone houses and farmyards, halting German infantry with rifles, machine guns, and the occasional bazooka. Outside Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, paratroopers felled trees across the causeway and mined the ditches, forcing German vehicles to crawl forward under fire. At La Fière Bridge, German armor tried repeated assaults only to be repelled by airborne squads firing from hedgerows at near point-blank range. The lack of effective communication compounded German frustration. Many units still relied on field telephones, which had been cut by American paratroopers during the night. Radios were scarce, often short-ranged, and disrupted by Allied jamming. Orders filtered through slowly, while small American teams seemed to move and strike with uncanny coordination. A German lieutenant later admitted, "They were scattered, but they fought as if they had planned it all. We could not understand how so few caused so much delay." Air power magnified the disruption. By late morning, Allied fighter-bombers began strafing German columns, attempting to push toward the beaches. Lacking cover and clear intelligence, German counterattacks arrived piecemeal rather than as a concentrated force. Each thrust ran into pockets of paratroopers who fought desperately to hold crossroads and bridges until reinforcements arrived. Panzer-Lehr Division, one of Germany's best armored formations, received orders to move toward the invasion front. But their advance was slowed by Allied bombing and the chaos sown by the paratroopers. Reports from German headquarters at St. Lo grew increasingly desperate. Enemy airborne forces block all roads to the coast. Counterattack delayed until situation clarified. The result was paralysis. Instead of driving the Americans from the causeways in the crucial first hours, German counterattacks dissolved into confusion. Paratroopers, many cut off and undersupplied, had nevertheless achieved their mission. By stalling the Wehrmacht's response, they ensured that the men landing on Utah Beach faced only scattered resistance rather than the full weight of German armor. The most extraordinary feature of the airborne assault was not the size of the force, but the effectiveness of its smallest parts. Thousands of paratroopers had missed their intended drop zones, yet instead of collapsing into disorganization, they formed improvised units wherever they landed. Squads from different companies, even different divisions, grouped together and began operating as if they had trained side by side. German officers could not understand it. Their doctrine assumed that soldiers without direct orders would become passive, waiting for commanders to regroup them. American paratroopers did the opposite. A corporal with 6 men might decide on his own to block a road, ambush a convoy, or destroy a bridge. Dozens of such actions rippled across the Cotentin Peninsula. To the Wehrmacht, it looked like a coordinated plan. In reality, it was the product of training that emphasized initiative over obedience. One German captain of the 709th Infantry Division later recalled, "They appeared everywhere. A few men would open fire, then disappear. We thought at least a battalion opposed us, but it was sometimes no more than 10. This illusion of strength multiplied the airborne's impact. German units advancing to the beaches reported constant skirmishes, ambushes, and roadblocks. Each delay, measured in minutes or hours, was precious time bought for the seaborne invasion. Examples abounded. In one village, a single squad cut telephone wires and forced German commanders to rely on runners, slowing communication by hours. Elsewhere, a pair of bazooka teams destroyed 2 armored cars before vanishing into hedgerows. At bridges along the Douve River, handfuls of paratroopers held positions against repeated assaults, fighting with grenades and captured weapons when ammunition ran low. The scattered nature of these actions convinced many German commanders that far more than 15,000 men had landed. Some estimated double or even triple the actual number. Fear and uncertainty did the work of entire divisions. American reports after the battle confirmed the effect. Units that had landed with only 30–40% of their strength still completed their missions because men refused to wait for orders. Every rifleman became a decision-maker, every squad a potential roadblock. For the Wehrmacht, it was a nightmare, an enemy that did not need mass to paralyze an entire front. In the early hours of June 6th, one of the most dramatic episodes of the airborne assault unfolded in the small Norman town of St. Mary-Glise. Situated at a key crossroads just inland from Utah Beach, the town controlled routes both north toward Cherbourg and south toward Carentan. If the Germans held it, reinforcements could flow to the coast. If the Americans seized it, the road network would be in Allied hands. Paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, were scattered across the countryside but gradually converged on the town. As they approached, chaos reigned. A fire had broken out in the center of St. Mary-Glise, illuminating the night sky. German defenders were already active, firefighting on one street while setting up machine guns on another. The flames lit the descending parachutes, making the Americans painfully visible targets. Some were shot before they touched the ground. One paratrooper, Private John Steele, became caught on the church steeple, dangling helplessly as the battle raged below. Despite the disastrous beginning, the Americans rallied. By 0430 hours, small groups had forced their way into the town. German resistance was fierce, but the scattered paratroopers attacked from multiple directions at once, confusing the defenders. Grenades and rifles cleared machine gun nests, while bazookas knocked out German vehicles parked in the narrow streets. By dawn, the Stars and Stripes flew over St. Mary-Glise, making it the first French town liberated during the invasion. German reaction was one of shock. Reports from the 709th Infantry Division described enemy airborne forces in control of St. Mary-Glise before daylight. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to seeing paratroopers as raiding forces, the capture of an entire town within hours of landing was incomprehensible. Officers feared that if the Americans could hold St. Mary-Glise, they would dominate the regional road network and sever communications between units. The fight did not end that morning. German counterattacks battered the paratroopers throughout June 6th, with artillery pounding the town and infantry launching repeated assaults. Each time the airborne held, reinforced by more scattered groups who drifted in throughout the day. By nightfall, St. Mary-Glise was firmly in American hands. For the Wehrmacht, the loss was more than tactical. It was symbolic. The first French town to be freed had fallen not to tanks or artillery, but to paratroopers dropped from the sky. German commanders, already stunned by the scale of the airborne landings, now faced the reality that entire towns could slip away before their reserves even reached the battlefield. Behind the dramatic victories of D-Day's airborne assault lay a heavy price. Of the roughly 15,000 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy, nearly 2,500 became casualties in the first 24 hours. Some were killed before they even touched the ground, their parachutes lit up by flares and tracers over towns like St. Mary-Glise. Others drowned in the flooded marshes of the Douve River Valley, dragged down by heavy equipment packs. Glider units suffered especially badly, wooden aircraft splintering against hedgerows and stone walls, scattering men and equipment across the fields. The losses were not evenly spread. Certain companies were reduced to half strength within hours. At La Fière Bridge, whole platoons were wiped out in desperate fighting to hold the causeway. In Carentan's approaches, squads fought until they were surrounded and destroyed. By the end of June 6th, many regiments reported fewer than two-thirds of their men still fit for combat. German observers were torn between satisfaction at inflicting such losses and alarm at the resilience of the Americans who survived. A report from the 91st Luftlande Division noted enemy casualties very heavy in the marshes, Nevertheless, resistance continues everywhere. Their losses do not reduce their activity. For the Wehrmacht, used to opponents breaking under such attrition, the ability of scattered survivors to regroup and continue fighting was deeply unsettling. The scattered nature of the drops also meant men often fought alone or in tiny groups. For every company that seized a bridge or crossroads, there were dozens of paratroopers cut off, huddled in hedgerows, unsure if they were the last Americans alive. Many of these men were captured within hours, marched away by German patrols, yet even those isolated losses added to the Germans' confusion. Prisoners were taken in so many places, so far apart, that officers concluded the airborne force must be far larger than reality. Despite the toll, the sacrifice achieved its purpose. Every minute that paratroopers held bridges, every hour that German reinforcements were delayed, translated directly into survival for the men landing on Utah Beach. The airborne divisions paid in blood for the fragile foothold on the French coast. Their losses were high, but their impact was even higher. For the Americans, June 6th was a day of heroism and heavy sacrifice. For the Germans, it was the first sign that even killing thousands could not blunt the momentum of an invasion that had arrived from the sky. As dawn broke on June 6th, the link between the airborne and the seaborne invasion became clear. While paratroopers fought to secure bridges and causeways inland, assault troops of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division stormed ashore at Utah Beach. The German plan had been simple: hold the beaches long enough for reserves to arrive and crush the invaders in the surf. That plan unraveled because every road to the coast now ran through fields already occupied by American paratroopers. By mid-morning, the 4th Infantry was moving inland through the flooded marshes. Instead of facing organized German counterattacks, they found airborne troops waiting. At Pupaville, paratroopers of the 506th had already fought their way to Causeway No. 1, securing the road just as the 1st Infantry units arrived. Eyewitnesses recalled exhausted, mud-smeared paratroopers waving the beach troops forward, shouting, "We've been waiting for you!" Further north, the 82nd Airborne clung to Lafayette Bridge. Without their defense, German armor could have rolled across the Murderette River straight into Utah's rear. Instead, paratroopers held out through repeated attacks, buying the hours needed for beach reinforcements to push inland. When elements of the 90th Infantry Division reached the area later that day, the link between the airborne and the seaborne forces was complete. German reports acknowledged the disruption. A message from LX-14 Corps headquarters admitted, "Enemy airborne troops block roads from Carentan to the beaches. Counterattacks cannot assemble. Movement to the coast delayed." For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to rapid concentration of reserves, the paralysis was devastating. The psychological effect was equally important. Beach units that might have been destroyed in isolation, instead, advanced with the knowledge that paratroopers were already ahead of them, holding key ground. American planners had gambled that scattered airborne units could delay German reinforcements long enough for the seaborne landings to gain a foothold. By the end of June 6th, that gamble had paid off. For German commanders, the realization was bitter. Not only had the Americans landed successfully by sea, but their airborne divisions had already cut the roads, seized villages, and denied the Wehrmacht its chance to strike back at the water's edge. The airborne and the beaches had joined hands, and with that link, the door into Normandy stood open. In the days after June 6th, German headquarters tried to piece together what had happened in the Cotentin Peninsula. Reports from the 91st Luftlande Division, the 709th Infantry, and scattered panzer units painted a picture of chaos, paratroopers appearing in villages, blowing bridges, blocking roads, and fighting from hedgerows at every turn. What stunned German commanders most was not just the scale of the drop, but the speed with which American paratroopers had turned confusion into advantage. The first shock was numerical. German estimates before D-Day suggested the Allies might risk 2,000 to 3,000 airborne troops in support of the invasion. In reality, 5 times that number had landed in a single night. Some Wehrmacht officers believed the figure even higher. One post-action report claimed, "Enemy airborne strength exceeds 40,000. Fear had inflated perception, but the point was clear. The Germans had been unprepared for an operation of such magnitude. Second was the independence of American units. German doctrine expected soldiers to hold position until ordered otherwise. When officers were killed or communications severed, units often became immobile. By contrast, American paratroopers fought aggressively in small groups, sometimes with no more than a squad holding a crossroads or bridge for hours. General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st, was killed near Picowville by a patrol of the 82nd Airborne, a reminder that even tiny units could strike decisive blows. The third shock was psychological. German troops had believed paratroopers to be elite raiders, useful for brief missions but unsustainable in prolonged combat. Yet the Americans had captured and held entire towns, Sainte-Mère-Église among them, and had resisted counterattacks all day. An officer in the 1058th Grenadier Regiment concluded grimly, "The enemy paratrooper fights like a regular infantryman, but appears everywhere at once." By the end of the first week, the verdict inside German staff meetings was sobering. The airborne landings had not only delayed reinforcements to the beaches, but had permanently disrupted command cohesion in the Cotentin. German doctrine had failed to anticipate that an opponent would risk entire divisions in one drop. That failure left commanders reacting instead of leading. For the Wehrmacht, the lesson was bitter. What they dismissed as impossible, a mass airborne assault on a continental scale, had happened, and it had helped secure the Allied foothold in Normandy. The shock of June 6th was not only tactical, it was doctrinal, and by the time German commanders realized it, the momentum of the invasion was already beyond their reach. By the time the dust settled over Normandy, the numbers spoke for themselves. In the first 24 hours, roughly 15,000 American paratroopers had jumped behind German lines. Casualties were heavy, nearly 2,500 men killed, wounded, or missing, but their sacrifice had achieved the mission. The causeways to Utah Beach were held, Sainte-Mère-Église was liberated, and German reinforcements were delayed at the moment of greatest danger. For the Wehrmacht, the shock lingered long after the gunfire faded. German commanders who had dismissed large-scale airborne operations as reckless now faced proof that American industry, training, and doctrine could make them work. Reports circulated through headquarters noting that Allied airborne troops had fought not as isolated raiders but as full infantry divisions. The fact that they had dropped in darkness, scattered across flooded terrain, and still managed to seize towns and bridges left German staff officers struggling to explain the failure. The impact went beyond Normandy. In Berlin, the General Staff reviewed the reports with disbelief. Hitler himself had banned further German mass drops after the disaster on Crete in 1941. Now he was forced to watch as the Americans carried out an operation on an even greater scale and succeeded. One captured German officer put it simply during interrogation, "We thought such a thing was madness." But the Americans had the machines, and they had the men willing to do it. For the Allies, the lesson was clear. Airborne troops could not win a war alone, but they could unhinge an enemy defense at the critical moment. The Normandy landings proved that paratroopers could delay, disrupt, and confuse entire divisions long enough for seaborne forces to break through. In the months that followed, airborne units would be used again in massive operations in southern France, in Holland during Operation Market Garden, and across the Rhine in Operation Varsity. Each time, German commanders faced the same bitter truth: they could never again assume their rear areas were safe. The legacy of June 6th was lasting. The U.S. Army Airborne had demonstrated that courage, initiative, and massed air transport could achieve the impossible. German commanders, stunned as they watched parachutes filling the night sky, had witnessed the future of warfare. What began as disbelief ended as realization. The Americans had changed the rules. Airborne soldiers had dropped from the darkness and altered the course of history.